This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Bonnie, thank you very much. Mayor and Mrs. Gwynn, thank you very much for inviting me to Ocala. And the many guests, I guess we got standing room only in the back there. And thanks to Ken for inviting me. This is a repeat performance for me for IHMC. And I'm happy to give you a glimpse at what NASA has done in the recent past and talk a little bit about what things we're going to do in our future in space. I was a Navy guy. My dad was a naval aviator. I always grew up around flying in airplanes. My dad worked on the early days of the space program. His company made the spacesuits for Mercury and Gemini spacecraft. And so I was always in a family where we were very conscious of what was going on in the early, kind of the heroic period of the space program. And there was always something in the back of my mind that I wanted to do. So I figured flying was a good way to get there. I went to the Naval Academy. Turned out that I was not able to fly when I graduated, so I went into the SEAL program, and I did that for 13 years. And in the middle of that, I had a chance to go to graduate school at MIT, and this is when the Shuttle Program started in the late 70s, and they were taking astronaut candidates who were not just pilots, and there were some doctors and engineers and scientists. And I looked at that and I said, you know, I've spent a lot of time in the water in my scuba gear, and it's a lot like being in a spacesuit. So I think I'll just apply and see what happens. And so I went down to NASA once, and they liked what I was saying, but they didn't pick me, so I kind of forgot about it. And 3 years later, I get a postcard in the mail from NASA and said, basically, we're doing another selection, and if you're interested, put your package into this address. And I kind of looked at it and kind of put it aside. And about 3 days later, because I had moved to different addresses, I got a second one from another address. And I thought about it, and I said, you know, there might be a message here. So I put in for a second try at NASA, and I got selected in 1984. I went down there with 17 other astronauts in what they call Astronaut Group 10. Any former Marines in the audience? U.S. Marines? Not a one. Okay. Sorry about that. So our every class now has a nickname, and our group of 17 started that. And we were at the bottom of the totem pole for getting a shuttle flight. And so we were trying to think of a name for our class that was close to being the scum of the earth. So we came up with maggots. And so, hey, maggot, you know, give me a cup of coffee. Or maggot, you know, your class is over here. It's not here. So, but it's become a tradition down in Houston now. Every class has a nickname, and it's the case that the class before the new class gives the new class their name. They have a big party. And so Vice President Pence was recently down at the Space Center in Houston, and he was talking to the new class of astronauts. I think there's 13 of them. One Navy SEAL guy, as a matter of fact. And so their new nickname are the Turtles. And I didn't know the story, so I asked one of my friends at NASA. I said, well, okay, why turtles? And he said, well, it comes from the vice president, because he was talking about what it takes to make things happen in Washington and probably in the space program. And he said, it's kind of like seeing a turtle who's sitting on top of a fence post. And you come away with the idea that he didn't get there all by himself. So they're the turtles. We were the maggots. I flew 3 shuttle flights. My first one was in 1988. This was after the Challenger accident. The space program was on its knees for about 2.5 years fixing things. Got it together. This was the second flight after the Challenger accident. We took off in December 1988, flew a high inclination flight up the East Coast and to 57 degrees north, 57 degrees south every time we went around the Earth, which was about 16 times every day. And we had a 4.5-day flight, and it was really an amazing experience. I did that 2 more times, once in 1990, and my last flight was in 1992 on Columbia. I had a 10-day mission with a crew that we did a lot of materials processing experiments, and we launched a satellite. It was a large reflector. It was an experiment that was put together in Europe, and its purpose is to serve as a part of a measuring scheme, and this is how we know that Peru is heading toward Okinawa 2 centimeters every year. We're using this satellite to measure the differences in the tectonic plates. Some of the things that happen in space are kind of interesting. I'm an engineer, I'm a technical kind of guy, and I always, science was not my motivation for doing any of this, but there's a lot of science that goes on in the space program, and some of it's pretty eye-watering. And one of the things that I just happened to be a part of was when you fly on the shuttle, it's usually so its belly is out to the universe and the top of the cockpit is looking down at the Earth. And so you're floating around with these big windows, and we have cameras, and some of them are large format cameras because they take very detailed pictures, and it's used to study things on the Earth. And so one day I got up early and nobody had the big camera, so I grabbed it, and we've got this list of places around the Earth that scientists want pictures of. And so we're going through the middle of the Caribbean, and I'm clacking away at the Mexican part of the Caribbean. And so we get back after the mission, and about a month later, all these films have been developed, and people are picking through the pictures, and this one sequence of slides comes up, and that's the stuff I shot. And one of the pictures is the part of the Mexican Peninsula. It's around where Cancun is, the Yucatan Peninsula. And the Yucatan has a lot of limestone. It's kind of what's happening in many parts of Florida where these sinkholes are dropping down. And it's a very distinct surface phenomenon you can see from space. And this guy runs his laser pointer, and he says, see these little sinkholes here? And he draws a big arc. You know, the arc's it turns out the arc's 100 miles across. And he says, anybody know what this is? And we're all going like, you know, we're the RCA dog looking at the speaker going, you know, we have no idea. And he said, well, this is a place on the Earth where we know that the crust of the Earth is depressed because people have explored for oil there. And when they drill, they hit bedrock, and the depth that they hit it tends to have a pattern. We know there's a big dish here, and this sequence of holes in the Earth's surface is part of the rim of this big dish. And he said, this is the place that the meteor crashed into the Caribbean 100 million years ago, and this is what killed the dinosaurs. And that stuff's pretty cool. And they've had pictures of it before, but this is the first one that you could really look and say, okay, I see the crater there. So that's cool stuff. 1992, NASA had been working for about 8 years since President Reagan's inception of the Space Station Freedom Program. And the program was really in bad shape because the space station kept getting redesigned. And every time Congress was voting on money for the space station, they would redesign it again. And this was going on and on and on. I was part of a team in 1992 and 93 that was in charge of trying to reorganize that, but it happened at the time that the Soviet Union had come apart. And you had hundreds of aerospace engineers, technicians, scientific people who were looking for something to do. And one of the things that they were kind of keen on at the time was taking all of their rocket technology and exporting it to the Iranians and the North Koreans. And so we said, you know, that's probably not a really good idea. How about if you guys work with us on the space station and we'll see what we can do? So the International Space Station program got started. We brought the Russians on board, and the rest is history, and I'm going to tell you all about it here shortly. But, you know, it's a typical government program. Anybody work for the government here, federal government? There are this, you know, the 7 stages of a good government program? You know, the first one is like wild enthusiasm. And then the second is like rampant confusion. You know, and the third thing is abject horror, you know. And it gets down to, you know, violent incrimination and search for the guilty. That's the next to the last one. And the very last step in a good government program is awards, promotions, and medals to people who had nothing to do with it. So the space station program isn't quite there yet, but it's getting to be a typical government program. But it's been very successful. We have 16 countries, including Japan, Canada, the European Space Agency. There's 13 countries there, and the Russians and the Brazilians. And we're all working together to put this orbital platform up and keep it running. And despite all the heartburn that we would have between Moscow and Washington sometimes, it's all working. And I talk to people regularly, all the way to the NASA administrator, and specifically to understand, are things okay with the Russians? And they universally say, despite all the drama that you see in the media about the US and Russia, this is still working pretty well. So, 1996, I got asked to put the first crew together to get ready to fly up and help do the construction for the International Space Station. And it launched in 2000 in the end of October to fly up to the station, which was about 200 miles up in orbit. And you'll see right now the video that goes through our preparations, our training, and the details of our 4.5-month mission in space. So Gordon, we could roll the video. I think we can roll the video. Space is big and it's dark. We're not. Oh, here we go. Okay. Yeah. So Gidzenko, Krikalev, Shepard, my 2 Russian cosmonauts, and myself, that's our crew patch. We do a lot of our training in Houston in a big water tank. And we practice being weightless by going in the tank and having weights that make us feel neutral. Sergei's getting into a Russian spacesuit here. Can you guys see okay? I can move this thing back a little bit. And our flight did not have scheduled spacewalks, but we had a lot of contingencies. So we practiced if things break outside, we'd have to go out and fix them. And this is how we got ready to do that. A lot of scuba diving. This is the biggest swimming pool in the country out in Houston. For the better part of 4 years, Sergei, Yuri, and I, here's Yuri and me, getting into a trainer. This is at the secret Russian training base outside of Moscow called Star City. We're practicing an entry from space back to Earth, and Yuri's pushing some buttons, and I'm reading the procedures with him. A lot of our training involves getting the crew ready for emergencies. This would be an emergency water landing. Here we're in the Black Sea, and we're paddling around waiting for ships and aircraft to find us and come rescue us. And it's a really good bonding experience for the crew. Part of it is winter survival, like your spacecraft came down in the middle of nowhere in the winter, which has actually happened in the Russian space program. So Yuri and I and Sergei were doing a little camping. And I was a SEAL. I did this professionally for 15 years, so I really like this part. And they couldn't make this part too tough for me. I had a good time. The assembly of the components of the station started 2 years before we flew. The first element went up in 1998, and it's the black thing on top of that big rocket. This is Kazakhstan, and it's going to go up about 200 miles. It's a 20-ton vehicle called Zarya, or Sunrise, and it's a self-contained unit that you see there. A month later, the shuttle went up and docked the first U.S. piece to Zarya called the Node. And here's Bob Cabana and Sergei, who got a twofer. He got assigned to this crew as well. And they finished that construction and came back. Yuri, Sergei, and I are again in the secret rocket factory outside of Moscow now, looking at the module that we're going to live in for our mission in space. The summer of 2000, that module, called the service module, again got launched from Kazakhstan, went up 200 miles, and Moscow Mission Control docked it remotely to the station. And now we're getting ready to go on our flight. Here, the crew is in Red Square. We're following a lot of the Russian tradition before their space flights. And we're down here in Kazakhstan now, October 2000. The white thing in the back is our spacecraft. But the really cool part of the launch prep was going next door into this museum where 50 years of Russian space history is all chronicled, and they're very keen on their history. So we signed some autographs and wrote in logbooks. But the really special thing was right next door. And this is about 3 miles from the launch pad. It's where they put all the rockets together. This is the cottage that Yuri Gagarin stayed in 1961 before he was the first human to travel into space. 3 days before our flight, our rocket's fully assembled on the ground. They're going to drag it out on a big railroad car, take it out to the launch pad and stick it up. This takes the Russians about 90 minutes. It would take the U.S. a day and a half to move the shuttle from the hangar to the launch area. And they get out there, they turn the switch, and they just crank that bad boy right up. It's pretty amazing. So the morning, October 31st, we get up about 3 o'clock in the morning. Get cleaned up, get a little bit to eat, and we're getting ready to get on the bus, go to the launch pad. Gonna have a little liquid refreshment here on the way. And this guy turned around and right after that threw a pint of water on the camera. It was amazing. So here we are down at the launch complex. Yuri's gonna drive the Soyuz up into orbit. He's saluting the general in charge of things. And we're gonna get on the bus. So here we are. We're out right at the launch pad. We're going to go on a ladder and take an elevator up about 200 feet to get in our capsule. And we're waving, and there are 400 people at the base of this rocket yelling and screaming and drinking, and half of them are smoking. And this is about 3,000 pounds of stuff that's getting ready to go boom, you know? But it's just the way they do it, and it works. 10:30 in the morning, we're out in the desert. It's very foggy in that time of the year. And this rocket's going to take off, and it's going to be in the clouds in about 3 seconds.
3, 2, 1. We have ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the Soyuz rocket, beginning the first expedition.
And I got to
the
tell you,
International
there
Space
is no
Station
person in the United States that would launch a rocket like that. Even if they had been drinking. This is the view inside the capsule. We're sitting in these little couches. I'm waving a little camera around. Sergei on the side and you're in the middle there. And just to give you a view of what the ascent looks like. And we switched to an onboard camera here. We're under 3 Gs. We're being pressed into our seats with 3 times the force of gravity. And we do this for about 9 minutes. We get up high enough and fast enough, they shut the engines down, and there, you see things floating. We're weightless now. We're free of the Earth. We're not going back to land anytime soon. And the fact that we got that done without anything going bang is we're pretty happy campers. You can see how tight that compartment is. I mean, you're just jammed in there, and you're hot. It's hot and sweaty. A couple hours later, they make sure that we don't have any air leaks. We start opening hatches. And we're in a living compartment now. This is where we're going to stay for about 2 days because we're tracking the space station, but we're way behind it and way under it. In every orbit, we're inching a little closer to it. When we get to the final stage, we're just going to blow a couple of rockets and we come in and dock. So it's 2 days of living in a Honda Civic with 2, yeah. And Yuri's asleep in his couch in the Soyuz capsule there in the middle. And we got a spacesuit that's just kind of airing out here. It's just to dry it, get the moisture out of it. And when you want to sleep, you generally want to restrain yourself so you don't go bumping around in the night. And so I would just strap myself to the side of this compartment and pull my lapel up so that the sunlight, which is coming in and out all the time, doesn't bother you. And that's life for 2 days doing that. Here's our home. We're about 1.5 miles away. We're both going 17,000 miles an hour. And so we're going to dock. There's a little docking radar that's spinning there. We're going to come around to the disc on the upper side of that and kind of slam into that cone in the back there. And here's the TV picture that Moscow saw on the ground. We're going to go in that dot that's kind of up at 11 o'clock in the picture. You can see everything's in Russian here, and if you listen, you'll hear some Russian words. Hopefully we'll hear some Russian words. So it says in Russian, we have contact and we have mechanical capture. So then we check the pressures out, and now we're inside.
As the real opening of the international space frontier, not just for a country, but for Russia, America, Europe, Japan, Canada, and all that are to follow.
So this is the 2nd of November. Our mission starts on board. Our job is to really unpack and assemble a lot of things, mostly inboard the station, and turning on all the systems that we need to sustain our life processes up there. Taking carbon dioxide out of the air, replenishing the oxygen, dealing with the water, turning the toilet on, a few things like that. Yuri's talking to Moscow. You see computer screens in the background. That was our control post. Sergei and Yuri fixing part of the air conditioning system. About a week after we got there, the first unmanned supply vessel came up again from Kazakhstan. And this one had a little trouble. The docking radar was malfunctioning, so Yuri had to fly it in manually, which ordinarily was a pretty straightforward job, but the cameras that he had to use had ice on the lenses. He had a really tough time docking it. He did a great job. Inside we have food, cameras, fresh food, and a few things like oxygen that you might want. December, the first of 3 shuttles launched in Florida, coming up with equipment and cargo for the space station. This is Atlantis. They're bringing the first of 4 large solar arrays, and the station has 4 on now. Each one produces about 25 kilowatts of electricity. That's enough to run 4 or 5 big houses here in Florida. And we have 4 of them. 2 astronauts go outside and do a bunch of spacewalks to hook up the data lines, the cooling, the electrical power, and the mechanical connections that we can turn this solar panel on, feed the batteries, and cool everything. And it results in...
the crew requests permission to come aboard.
So,
Endeavor, permission granted.
after a week of spacewalking, this is Brent Jett, Navy guy. I'm a Navy guy. So now they do this all the time on the space station. It's kind of a Navy thing. Any Air Force guys in the audience? Yeah, well, they're going to be doing this in space for about the next 1,000 years, so just have to get used to it. So we watched Atlantis undock, go away in middle of the winter. We're still fixing things. Yuri's, we got a bent pin on some electrical connector. A big part of our day was exercise. And we had 3 devices, a treadmill, a bicycle ergometer, and a little weight gizmo. And we used those generally about 2 sessions for each of us each day. And they were very important in maintaining your physical capacity so when you got back on Earth, you could be functional. The highlight of the day was getting at the food. The cuisine, this is the galley here. The cuisine was half U.S. food and half Russian. And actually, I got to where I like the Russian food better. And you think, Russians, what's the deal? But ever since Napoleon went through Moscow, their cooking has come up a long way. And so we would gather around the galley table here and kind of discuss how the day was going and plan out the next part of our flight. And it was a very good environment because it's kind of interesting, and we'll talk about that maybe in Q&A, but when you're with a crew like this and you're dealing with multiple, I can assure you, when you're dealing with multiple different control centers on the ground, it's the crew versus the ground. And we were very tight in that regard. So Sergei's drinking his iced tea, and
2, 1, 0, and liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis with Destiny.
So it's January. Atlantis coming up with a big U.S. laboratory. It's about the size of a school bus. And this is really the purpose of the space station, is to provide what's necessary to have laboratories in space to do research, materials, biology, life sciences, chemistry, physics, earth science, space science, looking at oceanography. Tom Jones, one of the astronauts that's hooking up the outside connections for the Destiny lab. And another astronaut floating outside, he's opening an optical window. It's Bob Kerbeam. And I'm inside wearing a golf shirt. Bob's outside. It's a total vacuum, minus 200 degrees. And we got about 3 inches of glass between us. So this is the inside of the lab. This is kind of when we opened it up.
Hatch to hatch, and it's full of bays for racks. We have 6 areas here. We're going to put experiment racks in. And forward, you'll see the hatch where the shuttles will be docking in the future when they come to visit Alpha.
This is an APCO that's been signed by all the folks who worked on the lab. And here it is in the lab. They'd be very proud of it. We're proud of it. We're going to bring that home. They can display it down at the Cape.
So as the crew finished up, they're going to pile through the hatch and go back to Florida.
Sadly.
Sadly is right.
Have a good trip.
Okay, thank you.
Good luck. Good luck. After that,
And many of these folks that we've known for years, and we've worked and trained together for this mission for a long time, and we're stuck in space for another couple months, and they're going to be down at Cape Kennedy drinking margaritas here in about a day and a half. So we continue to work on things. Sergei's talking to Moscow here on the radio. He's fixing something on the galley table there. The docs wanted us to whip out the stethoscope and make sure we're all alive every month or so. And I'm checking Yuri's liver, and Sergei's telling me he doesn't have one anymore. We don't weigh anything in space. This is the only way we can measure our mass, a little pendulum. And every couple of days we have to bag the trash up and put it in the supply vehicle. You know, as we empty the good stuff out, we put the trash back in. And when it's full, we undock it. It goes in the upper atmosphere and burns up. And it's really a pretty good system. It works quite well. March 2001 now, Discovery, the third shuttle to come visit while we're in space, has two elements of their mission. One, to bring a big logistics module that was built in Italy. And this is the way big things get taken from Earth and put inside the station. And you'll see that in just a second here. It's like half a school bus inside this thing. And it's just jam-packed with cargo. But weightlessness is really kind of cool because here's Jim single-handedly extracting a rack from the MPLM. This rack weighs 800 pounds. He's moving it with two fingers.
First expedition crew is present and accounted for. Change of command is an ancient naval tradition. The passage of responsibility for mission, welfare of crew, and integrity of vessel from one individual to another. Space Station Alpha has been commissioned in orbit. The service module has been activated. The power element and laboratory module have been brought aboard. A successful resupply mission with Discovery and her crew is complete. Station is at normal condition. All systems functional and ready to carry out operations. We are on a true spaceship now, making our way above any earthly boundary. We are not the first crew to board Alpha or the last to depart, but we have made Alpha come alive. We gave her a name and put substance to the ideas that our crews can work together as equals and our countries as partners, that we may proceed with bolder and more enterprising voyages in space, with benefit from our differences and with a stronger purpose in our common goals. We pass to your care Alpha's log with the hope that many successful entries here are recorded, that explorations are prodigious and discoveries wondrous. May the goodwill, spirit, and sense of mission we have enjoyed on board endure. Sail her well. I am ready to be relieved.
And I relieve you.
First change of command ever in space. Right now they do it every couple of months, and again for about the next 1,000 years. This is going to go. This can be what's going on. So we piled on to Discovery, closed the hatches, undocked, looked at our home, how it had grown in the 4.5 months we'd been there. Shuttle crew orbited the Earth for another day and a half, lined up for the runway in Florida, landed at Kennedy Space Center in the middle of the night.
Main gear touchdown. Kelly will be deploying the drag chute a moment from now. Discovery rolling out on runway 15 at the Kennedy Space Center, wrapping up a 5.3 million mile mission, bringing home the first residents of the International Space Station after 4.5 months in orbit.
So when the shuttle stops, we get up, get out of our suits, and we spend a little time back at the Kennedy Space Center getting adjusted, and we jump on a plane, go to Houston, and here we are arriving back at the Space Center in Houston, where all of the training and operations and the program management all are. And we get a chance to say hi to all the NASA bigwigs.
Great job. It's great to be home.
And it's very customary. We have a big celebration when we all arrive. They have a hangar full of people, many of whom worked for years to make this mission a success. And I was there with my wife, and my dogs hadn't seen my wife in 8 days, and they hadn't seen me in about a year. But you can guess who feeds them. So we were on the podium for a while, and there was a lot of yelling and screaming and speeches and whatnot. But the best part was after this, we got a chance to just calm down and really talk with all the people who had been around our mission, helping us put it together and keep things the way they should be. Yuri and his two sons. And I was trying to make sure my dogs knew who the hell I was. And that was our flight. So I think we got time for some good questions, and we got somebody with a mic, and I'll help too. But I just want to point out, my wife Beth is here tonight. Come on. And she was in charge of astronaut rehabilitation. She's got a lot of experience, not only with our flight, but also the Mir program, which was a space station the Russians had, which preceded ours, and a lot of work with shuttle crews. So if there's anything medical, rehabilitation, deconditioning, whatever, I'm going to let my wife answer those questions. So we had a question here.
This may sound like a dumb question, but I've always wondered about this. When I'm flying and there's a little bit of turbulence, I get a little nervous and upset.
You're flying?
Yeah. Do y'all get nervous and scared?
I do. Usually the dynamic parts of your flight, particularly on like the shuttle, you rehearse them hundreds of times. So you are very conditioned on what things should look like, and you're prepared to deal with circumstances that start looking abnormal. And fortunately, all of my shuttle flights and my Russian flight, everything went pretty much as planned. So you don't get that perturbed about it. But the most anxious, I guess, I ever got in space was early on in our flight, we were scheduled to have a press conference, and it was going to happen when we were flying over Europe, and we had a radio link where we could send a TV signal down to the ground. And we knew this was coming. We had a TV camera rigged in our module. This was like 3 days after we got there, and there's bags and stuff all over the place, and it was a real scramble. So you've got this TV camera, and the audio comes up, and you start hearing. This is a room full of reporters in Russia, probably 50 to 100 of them. Most of them are probably not sober. You're on live TV. They can see and hear you. You can't see them. You can't hear them very well. And they're going to ask you stupid questions in Russian. And you better have a good answer. I mean, that is stress right there. So.
It was a great speech, sir. I was wondering, in your opinion, this may be a little off the subject, Elon Musk's vision to go to Mars. How do you feel about that?
I think it's really immature. I think a Mars mission ought to be very expansive. We ought to go to Mars to be there for a while. It's going to take a lot of resources. It's going to take big rockets. I think it's very ambitious and pretty naive for Mr. Musk to project that that's what he's going to do. I mean, more power to him if he can do it, and he's proven his critics wrong a number of times, but I just think he's underestimating the scope of it. You guys are going to have to help me with the mics here.
Hi. I would love you to explain in real detail what it's like when you launch, what the feeling is like. For us laymen, we see that, and for me, it would be like the most amazing experience. Can you explain what it's really like to launch into space?
It's a little bit different between the shuttle and the Russian program, because the shuttle has solid rockets, and they burn not that smoothly, so it's kind of bumpy for the first 2 minutes. After that, it's like being on electric motors. But when you start on the shuttle, it's very similar to being in your car and getting rear-ended by a truck going about 10 miles an hour. So you have this jolt that you're thrown back in your seat, and then it's about like having a 270-pound linebacker standing right in the middle of your chest. And if you want to practice that, that's exactly what it's going to feel like. I'm under microphone control here, so you guys gotta be quick on your feet here. You guys got to do it for me. Yeah.
Your first time up, did you have any personal reflections on how fortunate you were in the beauty and the majesty of the Earth?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I'm not a super religious or a superstitious guy, but one thing that relates to that, the first flight was a winter flight. We had, as I said before, high inclination, so we're going way far north and way far south every orbit. The second day I was up early, I was the first guy up, and I'm looking around, really quiet, and we're somewhere over Russia, like Siberia. And I'm looking out the window. Everything I can see out the window is pure white because it's winter. So I'm looking around, and you can see 1,000 miles in any direction. I'm going, you know, I don't see any buildings. I don't see any smokestacks. I don't see any roads, any dams, any jet contrails. There's nothing out there. And what I felt in that moment was, you know, maybe something happened when I was asleep at night, and we're in orbit around some other planet. And I thought a lot about that. You know, why not? Why shouldn't that be what we're looking at? And so I had that sense that the space program's done some wondrous things, but you know, that show is a long way from being over, and we need to have that audacity in what we do next. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about. Why is the space station important? And what I think we should recognize is tonight we have people right this very minute who are on the space station, and they're looking out the window and they see Earth over here, but they've been up there, some of them for months, and they're going to be there sometimes for a year or more. They see that as their home, and they're not really residents of Earth, at least for that period of time. And we're in an era now where we are starting to cultivate groups of people, international, who don't live on Earth. And the real question that space station is asking is, you know, how far can we take that? Is this something that, are we only destined to be hanging around the Earth and maybe the moon? Or are we able to go other places, live there, work there, be productive? And that's part of why we have a space station, is to get an answer to that question. Okay.
What did it feel like when you stepped off the space shuttle after the time you were in space?
I felt pretty good. I was able to walk around and kind of make my way without too much difficulty. I didn't know this, but my wife had bet that I was going to be on my butt, and she and I got to say she lost. But many people have problems with their inner ear, because that's your sense for your balance. And when you're weightless, these little hairs in your ear that normally get tickled by fluid moving around, that doesn't happen. And so your ear gets confused about which way is up and which way is down. And it makes some people, their very similar to being seasick for the first couple days they're in space, and sometimes it returns when they come back to Earth. They feel the same way after they land. The good news is it only lasts at the most for about 2 or 3 days, and not everybody has it. So we're still trying to understand why it affects some people and not others. But my experience coming back was really good, so not to worry.
I'm a high school teacher. I wish you could come to my school and speak. Also, if any of y'all are supporters of the Marion County Public Education Foundation, I want to thank you because I just got a $2,000 grant to take my kids to the Space Center.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah, it would have been $40 a piece, which a lot of them couldn't afford. I actually have 2 questions. One, I couldn't help but wonder, how's your Russian?
It's pretty good.
And 2, I'm wondering about when
Можно говорить по-русски? Отлично.
Nostrovia, that's all I know.
Okay.
And 2, I'm curious about the effects on the body when you come back. Well, first off, how many fewer calories do you consume in space in order to maintain about the same body mass? And I'm sure you lose muscle and bone mass. And is it really easy to gain a lot of fat?
I'm going to let my wife handle the deconditioning. I'll talk a little bit about the diet. Normally, we're scheduled to have about 2,500 calories a day. And most of the experience that American astronauts had flying with the Russians on the earlier station called the Mir, I think every one of them lost weight. And some people lost a lot of weight, like normal body weight would be 150, 160. They came back having lost 15, 18 pounds. And everybody's going, all right, what's going on here? So I was determined I was not going to be one of those data points. So I came back 5 pounds heavier than when I took off. I made a point. But I do have, I'll let my wife address the deconditioning thing, but I do have one bone to pick with science teachers. Okay? So I do go to science, I like 7th, 8th grade science class, and I like talking to the kids to find out what they know. And what I find is it's as much about the teachers as the kids. The teachers have to have interest and hunger for, exploring new areas and sharing that knowledge. And I gotta tell you, I think we're in big trouble in this country in the educational system because I think we're losing our mojo. And I'm always amazed at what I quiz kids on what they know, and I got the science teacher over here either coaching the kid, and I'm telling him, shut up, let the kid talk, or the kid's trying to give me the right answer and the teacher's giving the wrong answer. I'm going like, how are we going to fix this? So I'm not promising to be at your school, but I will do what I can to help you fix that problem. Beth, you want to talk about rehab? What happens to astronauts? Yeah, sure you do. Yeah. Come on,
Thank you so
up.
much. Basically, for every 30 days that they're off the planet, they can lose 1.5% to 2% bone mass. So one of the projects that I worked on initially was the resistive exercise device. So that, because we know that with strength training, that's what helps people to help prevent osteoporosis. So that was our theory, that with strength training on board, we would help minimize the bone loss. Cardiovascular-wise, they can also lose 20 to 30%, and they start losing that right away. That's why initially the Russians would not start any cardiovascular training for 7 to 14 days, whereas we had them starting as soon as they got up there, and that helped minimize that. There's just a lot of things going on physiologically initially until the body adapts to being in space. So we also had to change the days that we did the testing, because we did test all the crews once a month. And initially we wanted to do that like on day 7, but we had to switch it to day 14, day 21, so that we would give the body a chance to adapt to being in weightlessness, because there was an effect like on the white blood count, red blood cells. So therefore we would get lower results on our cardiovascular fitness because the red blood cells were being so depleted because they didn't have time to catch up, that type of thing. So, we learned a lot. We learned a lot from initially when the crews We had U.S. astronauts on the Mir space station. And so a lot of what we learned from that experience, we were able to put into use for the first crew. So that's why we had better results with the first crew coming home.
I think people would have to realize if we're planning on a mission to Mars and a return, depending upon how you go, and there's some options with that, but every path that we can reasonably get there and back now will involve about 7 to 9 months of weightless travel in space. So these are all big questions that we have to get answers to.
And because Mars has gravity too, so if you're going to lose 1.5 to 2% bone mass and then you're going to step out into partial gravity, you know, that was always my biggest concern with people coming back to Earth is doing too much, you know, people that really like to jog and they want to go out and jog and the next thing you know, they're breaking something.
I got to tell one war story. So I was kind of a problem child when we landed because I was feeling pretty good and you know, I was kind of like, okay, you know, what's next? And so one morning we got up, we had to go to some meeting with our doctors. And when you're post-landing, when you're just walking down the hall, you got two people kind of one step behind that are, you know, ready, you know, if you get dizzy or something to catch you. And once in a while that's needed, but I was feeling pretty good. So we got to the parking lot and I was looking at this little van we're going to get in, and my doctor was there, and he was going to drive us. And I said, hey, and I'm looking around. There's nobody. It's like 6 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. There's nobody there. I'm going, Terry, let me get in this van, see if I can drive us around a little bit. You know, just in the parking lot here. I'll be real careful. And so I got in the van, and I was driving around, and turning, I had to take my time, but I could do it. And so I was thinking, you know, if people land after a long trip to go to Mars, they're going to be on some sort of lander, they're going to be on the surface, they're going to be walking around, they're going to have to do things like this. And I got out of the van, I slammed the door, and I said to myself, we can do this.
What is it? We have time for one more after this. Yeah, this one and okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. What I'd like to do, sir, is to tell you how wonderful it is to be here. Such an honor that you came to talk with us. Truly, it's an amazing thing. You know, you're one in a million, and it really makes me very, very proud to be an American. Thank you so much for everything. It's absolutely phenomenal. The other question I wanted to ask you, and that is, while in space and also in preparation for your trips, you all had to speak together. What was the language of choice?
When it was something really serious that I wanted to really make sure I understood, I usually used English, but I was okay in Russian. My two cosmonauts, one guy was a native English speaker for all intents and purposes, and the other guy was certainly capable at a conversational level. But one of my greatest enjoyments was there was a day when we had gotten up, and in the morning we have these instructions that come up from the ground, depending upon who's in control and what we're doing. So we had a stack of messages from Houston, one of which was, we're supposed to do some activity at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but they want to change the schedule and they want something else done in that time. So I'm drinking my cup of coffee and I'm writing notes in my plan of the day, so I put that down. 30 minutes later, we're over Europe, we're talking to Moscow, and they're talking to us and they're saying, no, that thing at 2 o'clock, we want this other thing in there, and, you know, scratch plan B and make it plan C. And this went on for a couple days, and then one day it happened again, and I got on the radio, and both centers can hear you because they're linked together. And I said to my Russian, I was talking to Moscow, and I said, "Eta blaha-muha." And that's essentially, that's BS in Russian. And the Russians were, they had never had anybody talk to them like that. And I'm going, look, we're up here, we're on the International Space Station. We're doing a mission for 16 countries and not what just Houston wants or what Moscow wants. You guys get your program together, and when you got it tightened up, give us a call and we'll do that program. But we're not doing one for each one of you. And that made me really happy.
We have time for one more question.
This is quite an honor for all of us. My question is, it sounds like you're in favor of continued space exploration. And if so, would it be logical that we would move from the space station to the moon as our primary outpost?
It would be only in the sense of using the moon as a training ground to go to Mars and elsewhere. I'm not sure what we would exploit on the moon that really has economic value, so going to the moon and back probably doesn't pay the freight in a commercial sense. But if you're going to Mars, before you commit to this 2 to 3 year mission, you'd probably like to have all the technologies that you're going to need on the Martian surface at least checked out, and you know that they're going to work, and the moon's a great place to do that. And we've been studying that aspect of going back to the moon for 30 years. We just got to do it. I just have to say that people ask me all the time, well, what are your thoughts about what is a Mars expedition going to look like? And I say, well, it's going to be 3 or 4 things that we're pretty sure about. One is the vehicles that go to Mars, there's going to be more than one of them, and they're going to be really big. The space station is 1 million pounds of stuff in orbit. The things that go to Mars are going to be bigger. These vehicles are going to be too big to be launched in one shot by even the heaviest launchers. They're going to have to go up to Earth orbit. They're going to have to be assembled with people doing spacewalks and robotic activities. These programs are going to be too expensive, too involved for any one country to foot the bill. We're going to have a consortium. We're going to have international partners that help us do this. And if you look today at the International Space Station, all these questions are behind us. This is the blueprint for how we do it. And I would just like to close and thank you all for coming tonight and being, clearly strong supporters of space stuff and hopefully what's happening here in the facility, the center. But how many people have gone to Cape Kennedy and seen a shuttle flight? So I like to compare that to what you would experience in flying an airplane. And I'm sure most of you have done air travel, and you look out the window, and if you have kids, your children might ask you, hey, Dad or Mom, how does this thing work? How does this fly? Why does the wing look the way it looks? And you'd explain something about it's curved and the air goes this way and all that, and it's all pretty much good. And so I think about that if you look at what it takes to design, let's say, your next Boeing 737 or your next Airbus, in that group of people that are doing that, there's somebody that knows everything there is to know about how to put the brakes together and the landing gear and the hydraulic system and tie it into the wing. And those guys understand kind of how the air flows over the wing and where the loads are and what the materials are and all the actuators and how it has to tie into the fuselage. And you just go layer by layer by layer. The reason why the airplane flies, from my point of view, is you've got thousands of people who have this understanding of what it takes to make that thing fly. And that's what's sustaining these vehicles. If you go to Florida and you look at the space shuttle flying or rockets taking off, whatever, it is really the interest and support of all the people in this country to back the space program. And I believe that is the real rocket fuel. That is what makes these vehicles fly. So I thank you for coming, and please keep up your support, because I think it's something that we all need to do. It's our future.
Let's thank our speaker.